Even more mystifying was the behaviour of the money supply. Despite the squeeze, it was still growing, something the monetarists thought impossible.
Well, it was all a bit embarrassing, people like me who were at the Bank of England, because we'd been forced, or the government had signed up for this path of gently declining monetary aggregates. And instead of the monetary aggregates gently declining, some 5 or 6 months after this new policy was put into operation, they took an enormous jump. And it was very difficult to know why, or to know what ought to be done about it.
By the end of 1980, unemployment had nearly doubled. Manufacturing output had fallen by a sixth. Britain was declining faster than even in the darkest days of the 1930s. Despite this, the politicians were convinced they were right. The laws of their science told them so.
Let me just have a word about monetarism and monetary control first. I mean, you all know full well that if you produce too much of something, its value will fall. That's elementary. It isn't a newfangled theory. It is as essential as the law of gravity, and you can't avoid it.
People used to say, "You're destroying my job," and I was absolutely secure in my conscience that their negotiators and their employers were destroying their jobs by not following rational expectations and seeing that if they didn't accommodate unit labor costs by a combination of pay increases allowed and rising productivity to what would keep their prices internationally competitive, jobs would go. So there was I, absolutely clear in my conscience, and there were they convinced in their, what I would call invincible ignorance, that I was an enemy. Yes, it was an awkward time.
There's no question that what was happening did, in my view, a great deal of damage to the economy. The politicians of the day will never admit to that. They never admit to making mistakes at all. But it's quite clear that's what was happening. They were trying to do it right, but they got it wrong.
In January 1981, Alan Walters became Mrs. Thatcher's economic advisor. Although a convinced monetarist, he agreed with Sir John Hoskins that interest rates would have to come down. This in turn would reduce the exchange rate and make exports more competitive. But the problem was how to do it without admitting that all the destruction of the past 2 years had been for nothing. The only solution, they said, was to cut even more from public spending. That way the government would be seen to be keeping up its squeeze on the money supply.
What we said was, we will take a deep breath and take an enormous amount of money out of the economy, but at the nadir of a major recession. I mean, it's against every textbook that's ever been written, or all the Keynesian conventional wisdom which prevailed at the time. And thus, hopefully, by that insurance, make it very unlikely that we would have to put interest rates back up again just at the wrong moment. At a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe, they were both absolutely taken aback. I think they could hardly believe their ears. And then Mrs. Thatcher saying very indignantly, you know, it's all very well for you, but you don't have to stand up and defend it in the House.
Do what you're told and no one will get hurt. Over there, everyone.
In the budget of 1981, public borrowing was cut by a fifth. 364 leading economists wrote to the Times and the Prime Minister, accusing her of virtually destroying the economy.
Just to impress upon you the need for caution.
That summer, there were riots in English cities that even some cabinet members blamed on the economic policy. Unemployment headed towards 2.5 million. Inflation did begin to fall, but the money supply continued its mysterious rise. It became clear that the fundamental law of monetarism, the relationship between the money supply and inflation, didn't work. Ever so quietly, this solution to Britain's problems was discarded. Finally, the man who had first brought the monetarist message to Britain was publicly told it was over.
Monetarist economists believe in something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is supposed to be the rate at which inflation stops or ceases to accelerate. Now, do you think that we, Prime Minister, with all-time record unemployment figures this week, have yet reached that natural rate, even though inflation is still proceeding sufficiently to halve the value of money every 15 years?
It's not a doctrine to which I've ever subscribed. It's one which I think actually came in with Milton Friedman. I used to read about it, I used to look about it. It's not a doctrine, it's a theory to which I've never subscribed.
Some of those who had lived through the experiment now became deeply pessimistic. One economist saw it as proof that it was fundamentally impossible to change, in a predictable way, how an economy behaved. As in other sciences, his observation had a formal name, Goodhart's law.
Goodhart's law said that if ever the government decides to rely on any particular statistical relationship as a basis for policy, as soon as it did that, that relationship would fall apart. And that's just what happened. The implication is that what you should try and do is not to disturb things too much and let individual agents go on and try and make the best of the situation as each of them sees it individually.